21. Are hybrids just hype? Let's define what we're talking about here. The focus is on diesel-electric passenger trains with energy storage. And this follows from a paper I presented at Core 2014 called Banking on Batteries, which considered replacing one out of 3 locos on a coal train with a battery loco. The idea is that regenerative braking energy is captured and stored in batteries or supercapacitors. This stored energy can then be used either instead of the engine, or to boost engine power and accelerating, or to drive auxiliary loads. We would not expect much benefit for high-speed trains which maintain a fairly constant high speed for most of the journey. But in Eastern Australia, trains do not run at constant high speed as there are many gradients, many curves, and many changes of speed. So you might expect some benefit. The question is, how much? Hybrids have become quite common in road vehicles since the introduction of the Toyota Prius some 20 years ago. But have they missed the train? So far, there are not many in rail applications. MTU makes a power pack for DMUs with a motor generator and mechanical transmission. This was tested for a few years in Germany. In the UK, Porterbrook has ordered 4 for fitting to the 168 and 170 class, and Irish Rail has ordered 9 for trials on the 22,000 class. But these are small numbers. Many European countries are committing to eliminate hydrocarbon-fueled road vehicles in the next decade or so, and Britain has committed to eliminate diesel-only trains by 2040. There is a general move away from diesel. In Europe, where electrification is widespread, EMUs with batteries are being introduced to fill gaps where DMUs currently operate. Ranges around 70 to 80 kilometres. For longer distances, they're looking to hydrogen, which powers the Alstom-Cordia I-Lint, for instance. It is a hybrid, but with fuel cells, not a diesel engine. So overseas, there is not a lot of interest. So would there be any benefit using hybrid technology in Australia? To find out, I did simulations for a train of similar capacity and performance to the ageing XPTs, which operate out of Sydney, comparing fuel consumption for a diesel-only version and a diesel hybrid with energy storage. Both trains have the same configuration of 1 power car and 5 trailers, but of course the one with energy storage would be heavier. I compared different types of routes, including high-speed long distance, hilly terrain with curves, and regional with many stops, to see how much fuel the hybrid saves. In practice, a smaller train would be used on some of these routes, but to aid comparison, I used the same configuration for all. The train set modelled has the following characteristics. The power car is loosely based on the Cairns tilt train power car with 2,400 kilowatts of engine power. Regenerative braking is 1,200 kilowatts, and storage is 320 kilowatt hours as supercapacitors, and this adds about 10 tonnes of weight to the train. As axle load and space do not permit much storage on the power car, the 4 80 kilowatt hour supercapacitor modules are distributed on the trailer cars. To give a fair comparison, a similar strategy was used in driving both sets. So don't go faster than necessary to meet timetable. Air drag increases with the square of speed, and at 160 km per hour, air drag is 80% of the total resistance. Braking later and harder allows higher average speed with little fuel penalty, but on the other hand, for the hybrid, you aim to minimise friction braking to recover maximum energy. You should use stored energy to avoid notches where brake-specific fuel consumption is higher. The table below is for a Cummins QSK38, and MTU and Caterpillar engines show similar patterns, where the highest efficiency is above 1500 RPM, and it's significantly lower at part loads. At 800 RPM, it's 25% higher than at 1700 RPM. And you should avoid idling and use regen to power auxiliaries in dynamic brake. This block diagram shows how the engine drives an alternator, which provides power for both the auxiliaries as well as traction. Power from the alternator is rectified feeding the DC bus, with inverters providing variable voltage, variable frequency for the traction motors and 50 Hz AC at 415 volts for the auxiliaries. But with the engine stopped, the energy storage can supply power to both traction and the auxiliaries. The auxiliary loads are listed. The typical load for air conditioning, lighting, etc. in the trailer cars is 25 kilowatts. The power car has some constant loads and also a variable load roughly proportional to engine power for cooling fans and blowers. The first set of routes considered are in the eastern states, and with the three routes currently served by the XPTs, Sydney to Brisbane, to Dubbo and Melbourne respectively. The interstate routes are nearly 1,000 kilometres. Dubbo involves crossing the Blue Mountains with many steep grades and tight curves. In addition are Sydney to Armidale and Canberra, which are currently served by DMU sets. And just for interest, I included the Overland from Melbourne to Adelaide. As some of you are in Western Australia, and I thought I would be too, I included Perth to Kalgoorlie, served by the Prospector, and the Overland, which runs from Perth to Bunbury. The Prospector route in particular is very flat compared to the East Coast. So what are the fuel savings? This table shows the XPT routes with fuel consumption in litres listed for the diesel and the hybrid. Focusing on the round trip figures, which are in bold, in the last column it is 16% for Brisbane, 21% for Melbourne and 24% for Dubbo. Note that the outward and return legs are almost equal for Melbourne, but for Dubbo it is a lot higher on the return, which is mostly downhill. The savings are higher on the regional routes, where the outward leg is uphill. For Canberra, the round trip saving is over 24% and 26% for Armidale. The return leg savings have 30% or more, but Melbourne to Adelaide is a moderate 17% saving. In Western Australia, the Kalgoorlie trip gives a saving of only 15.6%, which might be expected for a flat, high-speed route. Interestingly, the saving for Bunbury is very high at 28%. It is the shortest route with a lot of stops. It is interesting to correlate the state of charge over the trip with the fuel savings. These graphs compare the level of stored energy for a run from Canberra to Sydney and Brisbane to Sydney. The purple line is altitude. Clearly, Canberra to Sydney is predominantly downhill, while Brisbane and Sydney are at the same level, with mostly smaller grades in between. For Canberra to Sydney, the blue line representing stored energy is increasing, but from Brisbane, it never gets to charge up. This table presents the duty cycle for the same two runs, with the bold columns giving the percentage of time in each power notch. For Canberra to Sydney, the zeros for idle up to notch 3 indicate the engine does not run, with power drawn from storage, and even in notch 5, runtime is greatly reduced. The higher notches use much the same fuel in both cases. Overall, the saving is 31%. For Brisbane to Sydney, idling is greatly reduced, and there is some reduction in notches 1 and 2, leading to a much smaller saving of only 15%. It is interesting to look at the influence of timetable. Currently, the timetable for Sydney to Brisbane has a lot of slack. The trip takes nearly 13 hours in each direction, and by judiciously increasing the speed in a few sections, travel time could easily be cut by half an hour overall. There would of course be a fuel penalty, but this penalty is much smaller for the hybrid than for the diesel, 46 versus 145 litres. Increasing speed on this tortuous winding route requires more braking, with the potential for more energy recovery. On a flat route with few speed changes, we would not expect much difference in the fuel penalty between diesel and hybrid. So more braking can mean more fuel saving, and in fact, dynamic brake energy is a predictor of the fuel saving. Here the routes are tabulated in order of increased fuel saving. It can be seen the total dynamic brake energy divided by distance, the second last column, is also increasing. In the last column, the relationship between dynamic brake energy and fuel saved is almost all in the range of 5 to 5.5 kilowatt hours per litre. Dubbo is the outlier, possibly because the storage reaches capacity descending the Blue Mountains and some of the energy is lost. But the conclusion is that for any particular route, if you can measure how much energy is dissipated in dynamic braking, you can save a litre of diesel fuel for every 5 kilowatt hours. So there's no free lunch. Is it worth doing? This table considers the Sydney to Melbourne case, which was in the middle of the range with 21% fuel saving. Note that all the costs given in the table are very, very approximate, so please don't question me on them. There are currently 2 services per day, and let us assume this is covered by 3 train sets. Fuel saving is 710 litres per round trip, with annual fuel saving of just over 500,000 litres, which is worth about $500,000. That is a lot of CO2 saved, by the way. For supercapacitors, the cost to fit the train is about $3.9 million, so it will take nearly 8 years to pay back the capital cost. But you will get perhaps 15 years of life from the supercapacitors, so in the long term, it is a good investment. Using NMC lithium ion is much cheaper. It will cost less than $1 million to equip 3 train sets, and payback will be less than 2 years. But the high charging current during dynamic braking will lead to short life, and you might need to replace the batteries in 3 to 4 years. LTO batteries are in the middle. Cost is about $1.8 million to equip 3 trains. The payback is about 4 years, and they are much more suited to high charge and discharge current. They will last perhaps 10 years, so they are probably the best option. Note that the benefits on regional routes where fuel savings are 25% or more will be greater. For routes like Sydney to Brisbane or Perth to Kalgoorlie, where the savings are only about 15%, the payback will take a lot longer. And so my conclusions. Hybrid technology using energy storage with diesel will save fuel and reduce emissions. The savings vary widely on different routes, from 16 to 26% on the return journeys examined here, and up to 36% in one direction. The routes with many speed restrictions and a high proportion of braking benefit the most. Dynamic brake energy can give a good estimate of the potential fuel savings, around 5 kilowatt hours per litre saved. But energy storage is expensive. It may take 5 to 8 years to recover the capital cost. For some routes, the cost will be recovered sooner, and for others, it may take beyond half the life of the vehicle. So thank you for listening, and I hope I can answer your questions.